It's been grown in the Pacific Northwest for a long time by gardeners. And so it's something that a lot of people were experimenting with and growing, but nobody had really been growing on a field scale around here. And it just seemed natural. It seemed like it really had already been proven that it could grow good here. And we experimented with it for years on a very small scale on our farm because we were curious about it. And then it just seemed like a natural fit.
Silver flash of fins, iridescent in the water as grain in the wind, grain in the wind.
It's time to taste the best food on the planet. Food for Thought explores the delicious stories from the Humboldt Nation. Meet the women and men who are growing it, foraging for it, raising it, preserving it, cooking it, and who share it with the rest of us.
It's related to lamb's quarter, which is a very common weed that most people are familiar with. It looks very similar, almost indistinguishable. It produces a lot of seed. You know, it depends on your definition of grain, but most grains are typically monocots, grasses, wheat, and barley, and corn, and rice, where this is a broadleaf, more like buckwheat, but it's eaten like a grain. Eaten just like a whole grain. Yeah. We originally just bought little seed packets that were offered by different seed companies to experiment with. But then when we decided we wanted to grow in a bigger way, we went to White Mountain Farm in Colorado. They've been growing for decades. They're definitely the pioneers of quinoa growing in this country. They're Ernie and Paul New. And we bought a white and black variety from them. And then we just bought seed from them for a year or two, and then we increased our own. But then we found that there were a lot of really interesting off-types in their quinoa. And we kind of disproportionately saved those, and we mixed them together, and that's how we ended up with the rainbow that we grow now. It's basically just White Mountain seeds from Colorado, but kind of disproportionately the weird ones put back in and mixed together. And so we ended up with kind of a rainbow one, and now that the more we grow it, the more it kind of becomes its own thing. It has more and more slightly different hues of color in it. And we save our seed every year. We try to make sure it gets real dry before we harvest. And then if it's not quite dry enough when we harvest, we put it through our seed cleaner a lot of times with a lot of fans blowing on it to make sure we get it dry so we can store the seed well. The biggest concern with growing quinoa, the biggest risk, is the rains. When it gets to a certain point of maturity, if it gets several days of wetness on it, it can sprout on the head and ruin it. So that's why we're always trying to plant as early as we can, because it's more and more likely to get those rains as late summer and early fall start coming on. We plant basically as early in the spring as we can get the ground ready. Ideally, we're planting end of April, May. But if the weather's kind of unsettled and rainy, we don't want to plant before it rains because of weeds and with soil compaction. This year, we didn't plant a lot of our fields until even early June. That's a concern because then we risk getting it rained on when it's nearing maturity, which can wreck it, make it sprout on the head. It's not the high altitudes that's the critical thing, it's the temperature. Right now, the varieties available in the world, even though they're working on other varieties, will only set seed if the temperature is below mid-80s. You know, once the temperature gets higher than that, it has trouble setting seed. It's a temperature thing. At those high altitudes, the temperature doesn't get that warm. And that's what we're here on the coast also. We don't get the real high temperatures on the coast. It's a temperature thing, not an altitude thing. Well, we've been growing on a small scale for well over 10 years, a very small scale. Growing it in a bigger way, I've been experimenting with for 7 years or so, just because we know there's the demand and we know that it's all coming from out of country, and we know that we can dry farm it, which is really handy. Dry farming anything is very similar techniques. It's keeping the moisture in the soil, which involves the most critical thing is keeping a mulch layer on the top of the soil. So if you get any kind of compaction or if a rain settles the soil, you lightly cultivate that. You got to really be careful with your seed bed preparation that you don't lose too much moisture. It's pretty much all machinery. All the ground prep is and the planting is, and then we cultivate. And then the harvesting, it's all by machine. We just use discs and rollers, and then we plant with planters behind the tractor. And we've experimented with several types, because there's not a set way of growing quinoa, of course, and so we've been experimenting with finding the best way to grow. We've been planting in rows, very thickly in rows. and then we can cultivate in between the rows and get rid of the weeds in between the rows, because a lot of our fields are pretty weedy to start with. But some people have been growing with a grain drill like they plant wheat, and they can't cultivate that for weeds or to break up the soil for dry farming to hold the moisture in. It's a good way to grow too if you don't think you're going to have a lot of weeds. So then we cultivate, and then you come back and harvest with a combine with a wheat type header that cuts it and sucks it all into the machine, and you get the quinoa. You know, you see the pictures, traditional pictures of it being grown, and the plants have a lot of space between them. And they get these big, beautiful heads of seed that are all, you know, big, beautiful, unique looking plants. We don't grow it that way at all at this point. We started out growing it that way, and we realized that that didn't work for our situation here. What happens when you grow it that way, plants far apart, is weed control becomes a lot more difficult. But the main thing that happens when the plants are grown far apart is it takes them a lot longer to mature. When you really crowd the plants, as I guess a lot of flower growers know, when plants are crowded, they flower quicker. We'll even notice that when at harvest time, that around the edge of the field, the plants will be all green because they have a little more room, where in the center, or just right in from the edge, they'll be all brown and ready to harvest. But we don't get those big, beautiful looking seed heads. It's all lots of little tiny seed heads, but they're all held right at the same height above the ground, and so it makes it much easier to combine. The combine, there's settings on the combine to where we get a pretty clean batch of seed right out of the combine. It looks pretty darn good right out of the combine. And then after that, we put it through a seed cleaner. What we do for the stuff we sell around town is we put it through a gravity table. And the gravity table differentiates things on weight. So that way, if you happen to have a little piece of dirt that's the same size as the seed in there, it'll get it out, and that's a security thing. It also takes out any little light piece of chaff that's the same size as a piece of seed that might have made it through the seed cleaner. And then after we put it through the gravity table, the quinoa needs to be scarified to take off the saponins. Well, yeah, they're a very bitter coating that's on the outside of the quinoa seed, and it's bad. It's not good to eat. It'll actually make you feel sick. What we do is we scarify our seed, and it pretty much gets rid of all the saponins. But there's a little bit of residual dust still on the seed because we don't have, you know, super high-tech vacuum equipment to suck that off. And so we need the customer to do a final rinse of the seed. It can be a really quick rinse, but they do need to give it a rinse. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that, and they'll complain or note that the seed tastes bitter. But we're trying to figure out a way to rinse it ourselves and then dry it. That's the tricky part. Rinsing it's easy, but for us to dry it in big quantities fast enough so it doesn't sprout, that's a tricky thing for us to do. They keep the birds from eating it because it's not really very edible by anything as it sits on the plant. Yeah, we've tried growing a saponin-free variety that was being experimented with. Yeah, the birds did start to go in on it. It proved to not be good for other reasons. That's why we don't grow it anymore. Each grower is growing between 20 and 200 acres around here approximately. Yeah. We've experimented with so many ways of growing this, and you know, and we have learned a lot in doing so. You know, we really have learned a lot. I'll always tell everybody all about the way we do things and what we've learned here and there along the way. It's fun to talk to other growers about that. There's one of the lily bulb farmers in Brookings area is a real good friend of mine, and he's growing 50 acres this year and wants to grow a lot more. And as you know, those guys have really been under the gun with all their, you know, their spraying. And so he's hoping to transition a lot of their land into organic quinoa, which is really neat. A lot being grown down the Fortuna area by James and Peter Bear and Marvin Peachy, and then Scott and Andrew Wilson. They're the ones that really fine-tuned how to harvest this stuff. Really figured out the best way to combine it because they're real good with equipment. Well, I think there's really not much of a market for non-organic anyhow. It seems to be the kind of thing that if people want quinoa, they pretty much want organic. I've always thought that other than weeds, it's a lot easier to grow organically, you know, for fertility-wise and stuff. So several years plus ago, we started talking to Lundberg Family Farms. Bryce Lundberg in particular we started talking to, and he was real interested in growing quinoa, and they'd been experimenting with it. And they came and visited us. The idea was put out there that we could grow quinoa for them. We slowly started entering into that and doing that for them. And we gave them seed of ours for them to try over there, and they gave us some seed to try. They have a lot of trouble over there, though. That's in the Central Valley in Richvale, California, over by Chico, you know, where they grow their thousands of acres of rice. It didn't work out over there. A lot of problems, just too warm to set seed. but also bug problems and other issues. They quickly realized that this was the place to grow quinoa. I kind of helped them figure out a couple places up here to buy. So they've now bought a couple pieces of land here in Humboldt County, in Lolita, and we farm those for them. And they have contracts with several growers in this area that are growing quinoa for them. I think it's up to about 800 acres now of quinoa altogether being grown for lumber in this area. It's been very interesting how it all happened, from just us growing a little bit to now growing more and more, and all these other growers now growing it around here too. And we're still selling locally. We're still selling straight to the stores, and we've kept our own processing equipment, even though we wonder why sometimes. And sometimes it seems like it might be easier just to sell it all to lumber and not have to deal with our processing equipment and doing it that way. But we've kind of held on to that just because we like to be able to sell local too. What we've been starting to see on fields that we've been using for several years, we're seeing that we're probably not going to be able to grow quinoa over and over again on the same field. But we were kind of hoping we could do it because we don't really have much else we can put in these fields. So we're starting to see some problems with some root rots that have built up over time specific to quinoa family type plants. And we're also starting to see some problems with flea beetles eating the quinoa when it's just coming up. So we're getting nervous about those things. The fact is the price has been plummeting for South American quinoa. Very, very low right now. And so the people we're selling our quinoa to, Lumberg family farms, they have to have a much higher price, 3-4 times higher price than South American quinoa. And so there's only a limited market for that premium price. And so there's a big concern that the amount of acreage that can be grown in this country is limited. It's not sure whether we can compete with the South American prices. Remains to be seen. One of the things going on is everybody's trying to figure out what the low price can be. We're all trying to figure out how low we're willing to go with price, because Lumberg's in a bad situation right now where they've committed to buying it for a certain price from us. But the price they're buying it for us from is twice what people can buy ready-to-eat Bolivian and Peruvian quinoa. And they still have to clean it and process it and package it. It's a problem. You know, if everything goes good, we can go pretty low in price, but there's a lot of risk. We're still trying to figure out how to deal with the risk. The risk being the rain, wrecking the crop. And so we're trying to figure out ways that we can maybe cut the stuff, cut it with a windrower, you know, a couple weeks prior to some expected rain, and let it dry down on the ground and then suck it up with pickup headers. Because Lumberg needs the price to be lower in order to be competitive. Because there's a very limited market for, you know, that premium of people that care about it being grown American. Just like if you go buy shoes, you know, I mean, American-made boots are going to cost you a lot more. And so we don't want it to be that way. We want to get the price down. And so we're trying to all work on figuring out a way to do that.
Food for Thought is a DreamMaker project of the Ink People Center for the Arts and is produced by Jennifer Bell and Jessica Eden. Some of the audio for this project was recorded in the KHSU studios.